Coming up next, Joe. Coming up next, Zoe. Coming up next, Joey. Coming up next, Zoe. Coming up next, Luz. Coming up next, Lucy. Coming up next, Anne. Coming up next, Anna. Coming up next, Cuddles. Coming up next, Cub. Coming up next, Handy. Coming up next, Pop. Coming up next, Russ. Coming up next, Russell. Coming up next, Disco Bear. Coming up next, Dylan. Coming up next, Marco. Coming up next, Michael. Coming up next, Splendid. Coming up next, Petunia. Coming up next, Nestle. Coming up next, Dynasty. Coming up next, Nestle. Coming up next, Dynasty. Coming up next, Nutty. Coming up next, Flippy. Coming up next, Nutty. Coming up next, Flippy. Coming up next, Lisa. Coming up next, Bert. Coming up next, Lumpy. Coming up next, Bart. Coming up next, Nestle All-Purpose Cream. Coming up next, the Cramp Dynasty. Coming up next, Nestle All-Purpose Cream. Coming up next, the Cramp Dynasty. Coming up next, Jonathan. Coming up next, Jesse. Coming up next, Just. Coming up next, Jessica. Coming up next, Destroy. Coming up next, Dookie. Coming up next, Alien Force. Coming up next, Kids Next Door. Coming up next, Cow and Chicken. Coming up next, I Am Weasel. Coming up next, Cow and Chicken. Coming up next, I Am Weasel.